My name is Raina Andrews. Some of you have met me already, but I'm the Senior Director of Community Engagement and Partnerships for Feeding America Eastern Wisconsin. This afternoon, I'm standing in for our President and CEO, Patty Habak, who also serves as the Vice Chair of the Feeding Wisconsin Board of Directors. So I hope you all are having a good time so far. Yes, yes? So, as we heard throughout the day yesterday, public policy is such an important and integral tool to solve hunger and improve health. It was great to see Calvin Boldebuck from Congressman Mark Pocan's office and Tassif Amen from the Senator Ron Johnson's office at the reception last night, right? It's great to see representation. Yes? Well, today we also have a representative, Flora Santos from Senator Tammy Baldwin's office. Where's Flora? Hey, Flora. Yes. Well, Flora's joined us for lunch today as a representative for Senator Tammy Baldwin to be her eyes and ears. So throughout the program and throughout the conference, as you've had some ideas and said, wow, I really wish our senator could hear this, well, see Flora. She's waiting for your comments. Okay. So it is my honor to thank United Healthcare for being our presenting sponsor of the second year in a row. So thank you very much, United Healthcare. United Healthcare has supported Feeding America Eastern Wisconsin and both Milwaukee and our Little Chute food banks. And many of our sister food banks in Wisconsin and across the nation, they have also been integral supporters of our statewide work. In fact, they were Feeding Wisconsin seed investors in 2013 through their Do Good, Live Well campaign. In 2018, they gave a transformative gift to help our state network of food pantries and food banks improve our infrastructure and training to be able to source and distribute fresh produce throughout the United Healthcare Produce Capacity Accelerator program. For all the participants in the room who are a part of that Produce Capacity Accelerator program, can you just raise your hand? Better yet, stand up. We can't see you. Stand up, stand up. It's a really nice, yes. Wonderful. We see some sprinkles over here. We want to thank the incredible volunteers and coordinators at these food pantries that are here today. Some of you may have attended the Consumer Insight session and the Fresh Solutions panel that we just had this afternoon. These projects were just some of the many projects funded by this year's investment in our network. So thank you. Now, I'd like you to please join me in welcoming Ellen Sexton, the CEO of United Healthcare's Community Plan of Wisconsin, to the stage. Ellen.
Well, greetings. I think this is on, right? Clearly, she just went through a list of just some of the things that we work on across the state of Wisconsin. We've been so proud to, one, work with Feeding Wisconsin in so many different ways. I think the example of, bringing more, still can't hear? Hello? Now I'm going to have to drop the mic. Well, I don't know where to start or what you heard or not, but again, we've just been so proud to sponsor the Hunger and Health Summit this year as well as last year, and I think the continuing support, and I mentioned it this morning, I think, what a difference is when you continue to work, and when you continue to work with the same group, that's when you can really start to make progress. And so, we've been proud to invest in the coolers. We've been proud to, donate time. We had one of our team members that actually for a month worked on a SNAP Feeding Wisconsin project. We of course have Ralph Beck, who's a board member that's part of it, and Dr. Graham that integrally works, and that's how we get to know you and how you get to know us. I know a number of you attended a session this morning that talked about mom's meals, getting meals to people who have been discharged from the hospital and seeing that readmit rate go from really big. We targeted 10%, and basically we came back and had only 4 readmits out of 50. So you can start to see how health and hunger go hand in hand, and how by providing healthy options, not only through food pantries, but in home to people, can really make a difference. So I hope you've enjoyed these sessions. It's why we do sponsor these things. I hope you've learned from them. I hope you walk away with new relationships. I hope you walk away with new ideas, and that you also feel inspired, right, to think about some of the different things that you can do. I promised David I would keep this brief because we have a great session ahead of us, and so I just want to thank you again for all that you do in our communities. Whatever it is, whatever your sector, whether it be food pantry, maybe you're a nutritionist, maybe you're actually in healthcare, this is how we all make a difference together, and I really appreciate what you do, not only for communities, but in many cases, United Healthcare members. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen, and the United Healthcare for your support of our network and food banks and food pantries. We certainly appreciate your contributions. Now, it is my great honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Sarah Smarsh. Every day in local communities throughout our state, we see firsthand the human impacts of much broader socio-political, economic forces at play that result in hardworking families having to make impossible trade-offs such as rent, food, and medicine. As we've been learning throughout the conference, these choices and sacrifices leave us with scars. Sarah knows about these scars through her first book, Heartland, a memoir of working hard and being broke in the richest country on earth, is an incredible firsthand account about how public policy, economic inequality, and culture played out in multiple generations of one family, her own. The book was an instant New York Times bestseller and was a finalist to the 2018 National Book Award. Please give a round of applause for today's speaker, Sarah Smarsh.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for the lovely introduction, and thanks to you all for having me. This is my favorite sort of group to address, and I'll tell you why. My book came out in September, and I've had the privilege of standing on a lot of stages since then. But often, what I find myself doing here in this country that for a few centuries has sort of denied that it had a class structure is trying to convince folks who were born into great privilege that this is something that they ought to be concerned about. This group in this room, I know just by you sitting here, already gets it. And you're all trying to solve these problems. You might have different ideas about how to do it, and you're coming together in this beautiful way to move forward for the good of the people of this beautiful state and region. But you all share a concern that is my concern as well, which is, as the subtitle of my book says, here we are in the richest country on earth by some measures, and yet there are millions of people who every day exist in poverty and food insecurity and all sorts of economic injustices that, as noted in the introduction, my family experienced firsthand. I'm going to read a little bit from my book, not too much here in a bit, but first I want to talk to you about my vantage on this issue of hunger and food and what it means. So yes, it's a primal need, of course, and what you are all in the business of doing is sort of keeping people sustained. But as you know, it goes deeper than that. And our relationship to food, our relationship to hunger has psychological, environmental, political, and perhaps even spiritual permutations that go deep to the marrow of being. So what I'm going to talk about today is really the what it means in a kind of metaphorical or just like lived experience to be hungry. So my family was, as we say, in poverty, below the poverty line. Sometimes the language that we go to describe these experiences becomes very abstract, and so it's one of the reasons I wrote my book, to kind of put a very specific and grounded and tangible picture on a page for people who haven't experienced it to understand. But, oh, and by the way, like, I never in a million years would have called myself poor, nor would my family have. We had a roof over our head, and there was usually enough food, which I'm going to go into a little bit. There were folks in my family who couldn't count on either of those things, and so by my estimation, we were okay. And I knew there were people at my family Christmas who were worse off than us, and so we dared not complain. And you know, I grew up for the most part in rural Kansas. There was certainly a kind of income strata that we were sort of at the bottom of, but it wasn't really a place that was like, whatever wealth existed there certainly wasn't ostentatious, and it was easy to feel like we were doing all right. It was when I got to college as a first-generation college student at the University of Kansas in 1998 that I, for the first time, was brushing up against, middle and upper middle class kids who had plenty and had never gone without, that I started piecing together like, oh, the reason that I've got 3 jobs, and in fact sometimes I'm stealing food as an undergraduate, first-generation college student in order to get by as this scholarship kid, is that my family is working just as hard as these other families, and yet for some reason we've got less to show for it. It's when I've had kind of what I would call like my class consciousness awakening. And I've spent pretty much 20 years as a journalist writing about those sorts of inequalities and what they might reveal about our country so that we can construct the policies and also cultural progress that would be required for a more equitable society. So that farm I mentioned I grew up on, I'm a 5th generation Kansas wheat farm kid, and we had cattle, hogs, chickens, and if that sounds like some semblance of abundance, in some ways I suppose it was. Like one of the great blessings that I was born into is that we were very close to the earth, and that's of course where all this food on our plates ultimately is derived from. And so we had a big garden, and I helped slaughter cows and pigs in a kind of dilapidated garage next to our 100-year-old farmhouse. So we'd have a deep freeze full of meat. But there were certain aspects of the food chain or the industrialized food system that you all know all too well that were broken in ways that were revealed by my family's experience of what was on our table. One example would be, I mentioned we were primarily a wheat farm. Red winter wheat was our main crop, as it is common in Kansas and the Midwest, and then one of my jobs during the summers, I'd drive our mid-century wheat truck to the grain elevator to weigh the grain, and that went into these big surplus storage bins that were in some ways kind of managed by government policy involving trade and things that were way over our heads as kind of workers at the bottom of the ladder. So wheat, of course, where we get bread. The bread on our table was white Wonder Bread wrapped in plastic that we got at the day-old bakery about 30 miles away from our farm. And so there's something in that contrast that I think is quite revealing about our global food system right now. We were sort of the cogs in a wheel that began this long chain of industry, and then it came back to us in the form of discount Wonder Bread. So we were producers of food, and in those ways there was an abundance. Then my parents got a divorce when I was 9 years old, and I moved to Wichita for a few years. So all of a sudden, I was in a little apartment in the biggest city in Kansas as this country kid. My mom's a single mom, very young. She was 17 when she got pregnant with me. Had a little brother. She's holding 3 jobs. She's working as a UPS delivery driver. She's my size, like a petite woman coming home with bruises. And those were the years that I experienced what we would call hunger. And that was because all of a sudden we were in a new context. It was my mom's brokest moment. Single mothers with children are the most common form of household in poverty in this country. and I lived that firsthand. You'll learn from my brief reading from my book, I did benefit from some public programs that might have helped mitigate the lack of resources for keeping me and my little brother fed. We qualified for free lunch at school. So often I didn't get breakfast, but I did get a hot lunch, and then my mom would put something together at dinner. Once, though, we moved around a lot during those years. Transience is certainly a feature of urban poverty, and what I was talking about before was a rural version, and that for me has deep roots in a very specific place. Urban poverty can be much more transient when you can't pay the rent and you get kicked out, or in the case of single women like my mother, maybe sometimes they're fleeing a bad situation on the domestic front. And so we changed a lot of addresses quite frequently, and that meant that I changed schools frequently, and that meant that all of the bureaucracy that's involved in, like, say, the free lunch program at the state level, which is related to federal funds, of course, had to follow me, and sometimes there were glitches, and kids fall through the cracks. And in 5th grade, actually, just a little story to get at the primary theme of what I'm going to read to you, is about what I would just boil down to one word: shame. Okay, so I was in 5th grade. I was a bright kid, very ambitious. I always, I was sort of improbably confident for a kid who came from my background, and I was always fighting for some kind of opportunity, and I wanted the teacher to call on me, and so, I was by no means some shrinking flower, and yet, by that age, I had absorbed, I was understanding at some sort of subconscious level that there was something about my family's experience that was kind of embarrassing, I guess. I wouldn't have the words for it at the time. But we changed schools. I'm in 5th grade, and I went through the line to get my lunch, which had always been, I'm not going to lie, I coveted the kids that would have they had like the cool lunch box, and their mother who, wasn't holding 3 jobs like my mom had time to put a lunch in there with a loving note. I was always jealous of those kids, but at any rate, I would be handed a plate of hot food from the school, and I don't remember the exact specifics of how this went down, but basically it was like they didn't give me my free lunch. And there had been some sort of, bureaucratic glitch where they didn't have me on record as one of the kids who should be receiving it. And I was too embarrassed to say something to anyone, and so I kind of shrunk away into a corner and just hoped that none of the teachers would notice that I didn't have a lunch. And I successfully did that every day of 5th grade. And so this, those sorts of wounds for me and scars, as was mentioned, they're really a generational legacy that I inherited, and that unfortunately millions of children, as we speak, are experiencing. Whether they're getting that lunch or not, they are simultaneously, I would argue, receiving a message from our country that is counter to the message you all represent as helpers and problem solvers through popular culture, media, and just the class dynamics of their small or mid-size or big towns. They are learning that there's something embarrassing or shameful about not having the resources as a family or an individual to pay for your food, and therefore asking for or receiving help becomes quite a conundrum. I'm going to read a little bit about that. This is from chapter 4 of my book, Heartland. It's called The Shame a Country Could Assign. And before I start, I want to let you know, when you hear me say you, I might say the word you a couple times in this passage. Want you to know who I'm speaking to. So I mentioned that I'm a 5th generation farm kid in terms of my origins. And by the way, I live 30 miles from that farm today. I have chosen to, I lived in New York for a few years. I've been in some cosmopolitan places, but I chose to go back to my home out of a sense of both civic responsibility as a journalist and a citizen, and also just love of place and my family and my home. I come from a place and an environment, this might be recognizable to some of you, that folks are encouraged to get out of. How did she get out? He got out. How are you going to get out? I don't like that kind of language because it suggests that certain places in this country are for people who have more worth and who can make it there. When in fact, as you all know, we make decisions about where to plant ourselves in this country, sometimes with calculations that have to do with more than just economic aspiration. And so anyway, I live in Kansas happily, alongside the same people you're going to hear me read about. And when you hear me say you, here's who I'm talking to. On my mom's side of the family, on my maternal line, I inherited a different kind of legacy. Dad's side, it's farming. On my mom's side of the family, what I inherited is family tradition of teen pregnancy. So I'm the first woman in my direct maternal line to not have a baby as a teenager, as far back as records were kept, as far as my research can find, like back to when women wore corsets. And that was something that I was very conscious of as a very young woman, even an adolescent. And so I understood that if I wanted to, as we say, break some of the cycles of my family, have some different outcomes than the very hardworking, brilliant people that I was surrounded by, that I was going to have to do things different. And one of the cycles I could see was the women in my family end up having babies like when they're still babies, and I'm going to make sure that I don't do that. And one way that I pulled that off, I guess, is I had this deeply located conversation in my psyche with that would-be child, this kid that I knew I was going to make sure that I didn't conceive or bring into the world as a young woman in poverty, because I could see by looking around that motherhood makes poverty harder and poverty makes motherhood harder. And while there can be a lot of love and beautiful things going on in that space, I knew that it was something that I didn't want. So when you hear me say you, I'm talking to that sort of entity, I guess we could say, a projection of a potential child. A couple days a week after my parents' divorce and our move to Wichita, Dad drove us to school in the enormous white 1970s Oldsmobile we'd grown up with. By then it was dented and had a sagging muffler, and you could hear its diesel engine from a block away. Matt was in kindergarten and would duck down on the maroon velour seat so that the kids outside the school wouldn't see him in such a jalopy. I was in 4th grade, old enough to keep my head up for Dad's sake, but sometimes I wanted to hide too. Psychologists say shame developed as an evolutionary function to curb bad individual behavior that could harm the group. But modern society has a way of shaming some people for no crime other than being born. Your original sin, the one I know well, would have been being born in need of economic help. In the United States, the shaming of the poor is a unique form of bigotry in that it's not necessarily about who or what you are, your skin color, the gender you're attracted to, having a womb. Rather, it's about what your actions have failed to accomplish. Financial success within capitalism, and the related implications about your worth in a supposed meritocracy. No one around me articulated these things, let alone complained about them. The worker who feels her poor circumstances result from some personal failure is less likely to have a grievance with a boss, policy, or system, and is less likely to protest, strike, or demand a raise. Further, the Midwestern Catholic ethos that surrounded me as a child defaulted to silence. Our sense that our struggles were our own fault, our acceptance of the way things was, helped keep American industry humming to the benefit of the wealthy. But the source of the shame I felt was not my own sin. It was our national disdain for anyone in financial need, which is spelled out in the laws of this country. The clearest evidence for America's contempt toward the struggling might be in its approach to welfare programs, framed by public policy and commentary as something so detestable that my family refused to apply when they qualified. When I was in middle school, Bill Clinton took office and helped usher in an era of welfare reform that emphasized personal responsibility. Federal legislation allowed states to require that recipients pee in a cup for drug tests, sign forms pledging they wouldn't conceive children while receiving benefits, do volunteer work to give back to the society they were supposedly mooching off, have their personal information entered into databases accessed by cops, have their social security numbers checked against criminal records. With that reform, discretion in dispersing funds was turned over to state governments. Some states chose to withhold monies from the poor to instead fund, say, marriage workshops attended by middle-class people in the interest of promoting family values that were surely the cure for poverty. In 1994, California created a costly electronic fingerprinting system for public assistance recipients. It was unnecessary and would lose more money in surveillance than it gained in busting fraud, experts warned, but lawmakers were more interested in sending a message than in saving money. The poor heard that message loud and clear across the country. For the next 2 decades, the number of people on welfare plummeted, even as assistance did not. And here I'm going to talk about my maternal grandma, Betty, who helped raise me. Throughout the 1960s, the decade in which Betty had her children, single mothers in poverty endured unannounced visits by caseworkers who tore through their closets, cabinets, trash cans, laundry baskets for evidence that a man had been there. Protecting the honorable taxpayer from the wily poor was the goal, and agents relished the chance to catch a man in a single mother's bed, essentially, in the government's view, catching a woman red-handed in the cookie jar of American wealth. If they found whiskers in the bathroom sink, the mother lost assistance for being deemed a scammer of the system. Surely the man was head of the household and hiding income support from the government, the thinking went. Welfare rolls had grown quickly during the baby boom after World War II, from 900,000 in 1945, the year my grandma Betty was born, to 3 million in 1960. Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia did a highly publicized investigation of supposedly rampant welfare fraud in 1962, the same year my grandma became a 16-year-old mother. With a newborn to feed, Betty saw no other option. She had left her husband for beating her. Plus, he'd gone AWOL from the Army and from fatherhood. Betty already had several years of experience waiting tables, but she couldn't wait tables and take care of her infant baby at the same time, so she went on the dole. "I'm ashamed to say it," she said when she confided in me about the welfare. I can only recall a handful of times she expressed a sense of shame about anything. Like most struggling families I knew, we presented ourselves as having an unassailable pride. She was on cash assistance only for a few weeks until she had the strength to work again, she told me. She balanced her work schedule with her mom's so they could trade off on baby duty. Public condemnation of welfare wasn't just a poverty problem, but a race problem. People of color and poor whites both faced stereotypes of indolence, but no one fared worse in those judgments than black women. During the 1960s, Louisiana passed a law excluding from cash benefits women in common law marriages or those who had given birth out of wedlock in the last 5 years, in the process excluding 6,000 families with 22,500 kids. 95% of those families were black. In 1965, New York politician Daniel Patrick Moynihan pushed a report attributing societal woes to the divorce rates and out-of-wedlock births among black families and, by extension, household leadership by black women. Maybe due to the civil rights and women's movements, attitudes toward poor women improved some in the 1970s. Welfare raids on women's homes ended. Richard Nixon counted it as a point of pride that federal funds for food assistance tripled during his presidency. By the time my mom was newly divorced in a small Wichita apartment with 2 little kids and no money, though, it was 1989, and President Reagan had just spent 2 terms demonizing so-called welfare queens. I didn't understand the racist component of the term when I was a kid. Sensing that it might apply to the women in my family, I absorbed the piece of the narrative that might someday apply to me. In many cases, no one loathed the concept of handouts more than the people who needed them. In the years I would have had you, I can't think of anything I was worse at than asking for or receiving help. Matt and I benefited from government programs after we moved to Wichita in 1989. Free school lunches, our first ever health insurance policies, after school care for Matt, all paid for by the state. Meanwhile, Mom was working her ass off. She had a string of retail jobs for which she would leave early in the morning. Matt and I, then in kindergarten and fourth grade, would get ourselves ready for school. We walked north as cars tore along West Street to get there early for the free breakfast Matt got to eat in the cafeteria. I didn't get free breakfast because it was available only for kindergartners. Then, the half of the day Matt wasn't in school like me, he'd spend in other programs like Head Start or Latchkey. If you learn anything in an environment in which you're expected to be grateful someone fed you, as the poor are supposed to be humbled by our grand welfare gestures, it's that somewhere someone has it worse and you dare not complain. Like many children in bad situations, I often heard how good I had it. The resented existence is painful. It is dangerous too, whether it's your sense of self-worth or your reproductive organs at stake. It took a lot of energy to defend myself on all those levels, and it made every day feel like I was standing against something that I wouldn't abide. All those wrong messages pierced and hurt me, but they didn't go to my core. If you had been born into this world, you would have felt that hurt too. But as a spirit, you were untroubled as the truth itself. I think that's the only way I survived like I did, having a voice inside me that I could trust to protect me and that I could protect in kind. Class, like race and all the other ways we divide ourselves up to make life miserable, is what I'd later learn is a social construct. That's what my family calls bullshit. And there are places in a person that bullshit can't touch. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I would love, if there's time, is there time to chat with you all? Let's just have a conversation with the time we've got left. I know you've been having a lot of those. Maybe this is an opportunity for a big group talk on this, this idea of the psychological underpinnings at work and what you're all out in the world doing.
And I have a microphone that I'm going to try to run to people so long as it's not in the middle. Or we'll get to you. Hands? Anybody? Comment? Question?
Thank you so much for reading your book. You mentioned earlier that you've been a journalist for the last 20 years talking about class distinction and other things. Can you talk a little bit about what you've learned in the last 20 years?
Oh my gosh, what a great question. So, well, one thing I have learned that I think is very heartening, some of what I read might come across as quite bleak, but I'm optimistic about a societal shift that is afoot that you are all part of. And here's why. I was telling some folks at my table that I got my first research grant to start working on this book when I was a senior in college in 2002. And about 2/3 of this book, which just came out last year, was done in 2005 when I was 25 years old. And for a decade, I could not get a literary agent to represent me or an editor to publish the book. And I was broke most of those years and working in various capacities as a journalist primarily. I have also done a little bit of work in the nonprofit sector as well as academia. But here's what I've learned is that we're at some sort of tipping point or kind of like a fever pitch in terms of wealth inequality, which happens to be at historic levels as we speak. And so this book finally did catch an agent's eye and a publisher's eye and was shared with the world. And now I am standing on this stage. And so for most of those 20 years, I was kind of singing a song that the country wasn't ready to hear yet. I suppose we might look at it that way. And so what I've learned is there is a shift at foot, and I know because I'm living it every day when I'm speaking to groups like you all over the country, and people have the same concerns. They are out to solve the same problems, and so I'm quite excited about that basically, this is a very old story, but we're finally reckoning with it and looking at it as a country. There's a great line, I'm not sure who said this first, but a problem well articulated is a problem half solved. So if we've been spending centuries pretending like this is a country where if you work hard, you get what you earn, there aren't too many problems that can be solved with that mindset. Thanks.
Thank you for your, I'm over here.
Hi.
Thank you, I'm over here. Thank you for your bravery in speaking out against injustice that exists in America. I was struck by the comment that you just made. Living in poverty means living in silence. Can you speak into what we, as partners in speaking out against injustices, can do together to speak with those who are silent?
Oh gosh, I love this question, and this actually kind of relates to my approach as a journalist. So what I always try to do, this book is called, they put a subtitle on it that says memoir, and that suggests it's like the story of my life, my individual triumph, my coming of age. It's actually a deeply intergenerational story for which I spent years interviewing my family to I hope humbly lift up their voices alongside mine. And that's how I approach my journalism too. As a reporter, I tend to try to get out of the way a little bit, even as I'm sort of guiding the conversation. And I think it's so important in the realm of policy making, direct services, any kind of engagement with rectifying societal woes, that we humble ourselves to the wisdom of the people who are directly experiencing the problem itself every day. So, I spent about 5 years in academia as a writing professor, and I saw firsthand how a lot of very well-intentioned people, well-meaning people, often had a lot of the information and knowledge that my family lacked in terms of, the structural and systemic forces at work in poverty and hunger, but they had never lived it firsthand, and so we're lacking a particular sort of wisdom that can help. So let's say a good example of this would be the kind of political dichotomy in our country pertaining to these issues is roughly like this, and forgive me for the reductive framing, but the conservative idea is hard work and free market, ought to, if not meddled with, should find its own balance, and then the liberal idea is lacking that balance. We're going to create government systems and programs to help the folks who are on the losing end and in that free market. And what I find what often both sides miss is that for one thing, people are working hard. They're just woefully underpaid, and that's documented in myriad research resources. And then on the side of public programs, and I will show my colors, I'm for a robust version of that, but I will say, as someone who's been on the receiving end, it doesn't necessarily feel good. And what the folks I know who are living among the working poor would just prefer a world where they didn't have to apply for help. And whatever that world looks like, the brilliance in this room could come up with. And in the meantime, that help absolutely must be given. But yeah, I think that having, and many of you I know are having those conversations every day, but I think always remembering that our assumptions about what someone needs or their how to help sometimes reveal some blind spots that have to do with the privilege of the problem solver. Thank you.
Are there some practical skills that, as a journalist, you may be able to impart amongst our almost 400 folks here about how to sort of sensitively and sort of ethically receive stories and retell, or that sort of thing?
Yeah. Well, this is what I would offer. So I often tell, and I'm a writer, I'm a language person, and so maybe predictably this is where my mind goes to answer this question, but I tell people that I speak two forms of English, country and fancy. And And if somebody who only speaks fancy talks to my family about politics, policy, whatever, there are a few things that happen that kind of shut down the conversation. One, my family, maybe on subconscious level, that shame I was talking about potentially gets triggered because it's like, this is a vocabulary and a language that often has to do with formalized higher education that they didn't get to receive. And while they're brilliant folks, they conjugate verbs differently than fancy English, and they don't know some of the terms that maybe here in this room we would throw around casually. And so one, I would say, meeting people where they are, but not with condescension or pity. It's like the paradox therein is that my family, they're like the most brilliant storyteller. I have like 3 college degrees, and they all have to do with writing. And I truly believe that what really makes me a writer, and where I learn most of my lessons about telling a story, maybe not about grammar proper, but about telling a story, comes from my family. And so, it's not for lack of intellect. It's just a different culture and experience that they've had. And so language is something to always be mindful of. Not to suggest some sort of talking down, but any way that someone, because for that matter, when you've been told in every classroom or kind of like professional space or through popular culture even that maybe portrays your demographic as backwards or ignorant, when you've received all these signals that you're lesser than in not just economic but intellectual and ideological ways, that can shut down your ability to communicate, So a lot of what you're doing, yes, it is in the realm of that primal need of food, but it is also a healing at a deeper level to validate someone's existence and worthiness of that food and the validity of the ideas that they have about how to solve some of the problems that you're all concerned with.
We got a request for you to project a little bit more, because it seems like some folks in back may have a
Sure.
hard time hearing.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for sharing your story. And I think some folks in the room would agree with me with the pervasive narrative that why can't they just pick themselves up by their bootstraps, right? We've all heard of that, right? I'm not on an island by myself, I know. And so with that narrative and you being able to pull yourself from out of the concrete, you're an example of, see, she got out. What do you say to those who perpetuate that narrative?
Yeah. Well, I think it's, I always like to kind of complicate this either or thing, because I did work darn hard, and if I hadn't, I would not have had the outcomes that I have. And yet, along the way, there were myriad, some might say blessings, some might say, privileged circumstances that shaped my path. So, for one thing, I was born with good health. White skin is a privilege in this country. Also, along the way, I had some great public school teachers. When I was a first-generation college student, this federally funded program found me and said, "You're going to apply for graduate school." And I said, "What is graduate school?" Literally. And because I couldn't even dream that big for myself. I thought, I done went to college. What are you talking about? And they, I didn't have a computer in my dorm room, and they said, "We're going to help you apply to graduate school. You can use the computer in our offices. We're going to pay for your application fees." That's the only reason I ever got a master's and ended up in the academy. And so it's, it's not, it's a both and. It's like, I don't have a problem with hard work, by the way. I love work. I was bred to work. I get bored if I'm not like engaged in some kind of productivity. That's a very American feature of my psyche. But my problem is how we value different kinds of work, specifically undervalue. And also how we so often, to your point, leave out of the equation all of the nuance and complexity that surround this bootstraps narrative. And so, to my mind, it's my job. You know, people talk about their college years, some folks, if they were born into a more squarely middle or upper middle class household, like, those were the best years of my life. Spring break at Cancun, parents were writing the check, whatever. College was the hardest years of my life. I often didn't have enough to eat. I was working several jobs to pay my living expenses. I've been financially independent since I was 17 years old. And so that moment was sort of those were the bridge years. And so, like, those years almost killed me. I mean, like at the level of mental health, it was a very distressing experience on many levels. And so what I tell people is, yeah, I did make it, I suppose we could say, in our American way of framing things, but it was almost impossible. And here we are in this wealthy country. It shouldn't be that hard. It doesn't have to be. It absolutely doesn't have to be. And so it's my responsibility on this stage not to say, see, I got out, wag my finger, why don't you? But rather to bear witness to how hard it was and to guide a conversation in this country about how we can make it easier.
Sarah, what you have said about, growing up rurally and coming to an urban place and living, your different experiences of living below the poverty line in both of those places, I relate to that, and I grew up in Western Iowa, and I've always thought about how, so I grew up middle class, but I had a lot of friends who grew up under the poverty line, and it just seems to me, moving to an urban setting, the systems in an urban setting of being able to help people are like, I'm helping people, and it's so formal. And I think that it seems to me that it's easier to live without shame if you are below the poverty line in a rural setting, because there's like, if you don't have enough money, like, hey, come over for a sleepover for 2 days and we're just gonna hang out. And like, I was so shocked when I went to college that you can just be like, oh, we're going to the movies tonight. Like, where I grew up, like, you planned for the movies for 3 weeks, even though I was of the middle class. Like, all of my friends, a lot of my friends anyway, I would never just be like, oh, we're going out to eat. It's everybody's coming over, and I struggle with that still in an urban environment. It just seems like you stay with your people, and I think it's much easier to feel shame in an urban environment if you are below the poverty line, just because it's that formality. And I don't know if you can speak to that.
Yeah, I think that makes good sense, and it might just have to do, with two things. One, population density. So if you're in, I think there were like 65 kids in my graduating high school class, because I ended up, after those couple of Wichita years, I did move back to the country and spent the rest of my upbringing on my grandparents' farm. And so I was at a small rural school, and when there's that few kids, and some of you might have had this experience, regardless, you kind of know who has money and who doesn't, but you just, you need bodies on the basketball team, and you, every kid does everything. I was in every sport somehow, and I think if I had been at a larger school where there were enough people that you could sort of create these have and have not assignments in terms of who got to do what, I would have felt it more keenly. And I think that's part of why, as I mentioned before, I didn't realize that we were poor till I got to college. So that's a great point.
Hi, just to sort of expand on that, I was wondering what differences you see in urban versus rural poverty, and what differences in strategies to combat that kind of poverty you see.
I think, well, there are a couple of things. One has to do with place, and you might guess by the title of my book, Heartland, that I'm very concerned with place in just a very literal geographical way in this country. I think we often leave it out of our conversations about identity and diversity. We sort of fancy ourselves like a post-place 21st century digital world where, yeah, on Facebook you can talk to someone instantly who is on the other side of the country, but nonetheless, I find that where we come from has an enormous impact on everything from our politics to our worldview, to our opportunities. And in particular, if you are choosing to reside in a place like maybe small town like West Iowa or small town Wisconsin or southern Kansas, if you're choosing to reside in such a place that is like less glamorous or sought after in our economic currents in this country, then your sense of place might be even intensified, because every day you are sort of in opposition to a kind of professional stream that would have you move to the coasts or New York or LA or whatever. So anyway, as far as the difference between urban and rural, I find that, as is mirrored in my own life experience, rural poverty tends to be folks who've been in that place for generations, and their poverty might well have something to do with the fact that for whatever choices, for whatever reasons, they have chosen to stay when industry, heck, most counties in Kansas, their population peaked in like 1905. Rural flight is not a new thing. It's a like post-industrial revolution thing. And so folks who are struggling in rural areas, it tends to be because they're hanging on and they don't want to leave a place that perhaps is not doesn't have many economic opportunities. And whereas urban poverty tends to be more transient in its populations for the reasons I talked about before. And the other thing I would say is there's also some distinctions in racial and ethnic demographics, certainly, but it's not as simple as folks would have it painted in, say, like the national media. So often I will say that my rural experience was overwhelmingly white. And then those years that I was in Wichita, the kids who had more in common with me in terms of economics were mostly people of color. And yet I want to say that it's not that when we talk about this rural-urban divide, a framework that I don't care for, often it's painted as like rural America is all white folks, and that's hardly the case. Dodge City, Kansas, is home to one of the country's meatpacking meccas, and it's also one of the most racially and ethnically diverse places in the Midwest because there have been so many immigrants moving to that area to take those jobs. So it's all quite complicated. I do, though, find that wherever I speak, whether it's a small town setting or like the Bronx, the economic realities, while they intersect with other aspects of their identity in myriad ways that distinguish them, they ask the same questions and they have the same concerns, and ultimately I think that those experiences are more similar than we would think.
Time for one last question, and I'm coming over to you.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm glad that you have brought in the racial disparities, some of the hardships that African American women and families have faced in the same context of your experiences, but maybe even somewhat heightened.
Yes.
But my thought was back to that 5th grade child and not getting that meal. And what would you have liked the adults to have done when you weren't getting that meal? I mean, you're in a group and you're in a school and not being noticed. And I know that, as a child, not being empowered to speak up either. So what would you have liked those adults to do, and what we can do for children in that same sense?
Thank you. And what a beautiful question. Did everybody hear her question? So she said, first piece, acknowledging the racial dynamics and inequities within the realm of class, and then she turned to the fifth grade kid, the fifth grade me that I had talked about earlier. What would I have wanted the adults in that setting to do? And of course, as a kid, I couldn't have articulated this, and no one's ever asked me that question. It's such a sweet question. I think that, she used the word in her question, I think, like invisible or unseen. So it was basically like adults weren't noticing me, and I could, because I think about class often, it's easy for me to theorize that if I were the child of, a woman who was the head of the PTA, I wouldn't have been invisible. My parents were never at the school. I didn't have any advocates in that space, as we might say, because they were all not just they're holding down a bunch of jobs, but they were also, I will confess, a little bit like unimpressed by the education system because it hadn't done much for them. And they didn't discourage me in school, but they weren't real big on it either. And I think that they had some scars that made them feel uncomfortable in that space. So I was kind of on my own in some ways and at the mercy of the adults, whether it's the teachers or the folks working in that cafeteria. And so I guess what I would say is, yeah, I would like for wherever that kid is today, I hope that the adults notice her. She might have, like she's wearing the same clothes she was wearing yesterday. Her hair isn't combed. Her parents aren't involved. People can't remember her name. So first thing would be to notice her as a human being, regardless of all of the above. But I think along with that, and just as important, would be that in saying something, to avoid any sort of scolding. A kid with that sort of background is already fighting an uphill battle to feel like she deserves that meal. And so to find any way to validate and ease the just very human discomfort that he or she would feel in that moment. Because part of what, I didn't want to get in trouble, and the way that little kids think about that things. And I came from a class and an experience where that's usually the only way you ever hear from authority is if you're late on the bill payment or whatever. So I would say to be noticed, but to be noticed gently and with great compassion. Thank you. Thanks.
I'm sorry, Sarah, that I jumped your cue a little bit there. I was so excited about your talk. Thank you so much. That was so lovely. I have a couple of important announcements to make before we go, including the prizes. So once I get to the prizes, if you have won a prize, come see us at the front desk to receive the prizes for beating everybody on the social board. But first, is Ruth anywhere in the house in her team? I see some folks milling about, but can we please give a warm round of applause to Ruth and the service staff who've done just an incredible job for us these last few days. I don't know where she is, but I hope you can hear it, Ruth, because you guys have been incredible. We want to thank obviously the chefs, the service staff, everybody who's made our stay here really, really incredible. Thank you so much. So on to the real business of who's won on the leaderboard. This is super important. So the impossible was done. Our staff, Amanda, was ousted from the leaderboard, and the winner on the leaderboard is Miss Alicia Cran with 31,000 points. She's one of the Hunger and Health Fellows this year. And I had dinner with her last night, and she is super quiet, but apparently she got all of these posts up for what she's been doing, which is incredible. Come see us or we will be in touch with you next year about your scholarship. For the second prize, which was the best photo wins the signed copy of Heartland. It is Megan Vanderweist with 10 hearts. Winner of a signed copy of Heartland. And I remember I said we had 5 pounds of coffee to give away. I was told from Kickapoo Coffee that people shouldn't have any more than 5 pounds. It's too much. It will go bad, or it won't taste as good. You can't get through it as quickly. And which is good because we had 2 great captions. And so we've split the 5 pounds of coffee into 2.5 bags of coffee. And the first winner is this, Rachel Cohen, on this quote, which is all opinions herein are sponsored and supported by Roger Williams. Photo of Venus Williams yesterday at lunch. And the second best caption, of course, and this was not my doing, seriously, but it's the caption of our selfie in the morning by Kelly Mommertz. Is there more coffee, anyone? Which, with my ugly smile there, or non-smile, that's exactly what I was thinking. Can somebody get me more coffee? We were told, too, that we had another giveaway from one of our food banks, and Cheyenne Lester apparently has won a T-shirt from Feed My People Food Bank. So if she's around, come to the front desk to pick that up. So with that, I want you all to fill out your surveys. Turn in your badges as you leave after the next session, right? So we have one more session after this. Turn in your badges as you leave. Fill out your session evaluations either on Whova or on the paper that is in the room. You can also fill out a conference evaluation on the orange paper. I think the blue or the green paper is the hunger study evaluation, so please fill that out and turn it in the duck box. What else? You guys can keep the conversations going on Whova. I don't know if you all have been seeing on the community board, there have been some incredible conversations over the last few days. Please stay connected. Please continue these conversations as you get back to your homes. There will be an email. We've been asked a lot about the decks. There will be an email coming out in the next few weeks about when the decks are being uploaded to our website. And watch for an email announcement about next year. We are growing, and we may be back, or maybe we may not be. So be on the lookout for that. Have a great afternoon. Thank you so much for being here.